The morning my daughter-in-law told me to find somewhere else to live, she was smiling. That's the part people find hardest to believe when I tell the story. Not the ultimatum itself. Not the way my son sat at the kitchen table pretending to be absorbed by something on his phone. Not even the fact that she'd clearly been rehearsing the conversation for weeks. It was the smile, polished and calm, like a woman who'd already decided how this would end and was simply delivering the final paperwork. I'd moved in with Daniel and Nicole 14 months earlier, after my wife Margaret passed. 41 years we had together. Margaret and I. We'd built a life in Savannah, a real one, the kind that accumulates slowly and without fanfare. Two careful people, making good decisions over many decades. When she died in October, the house on Whitfield Avenue felt less like home and more like a museum of everything I'd lost. Daniel called me every few days that first month. "Dad, why don't you come stay with us for a while? Just until you find your footing again. Just until you figure out what's next." I drove up to Raleigh in November with 2 suitcases and a box of books. Their guest room was comfortable. Daniel had lived his whole adult life at 20% below what he earned, a habit I'd worked hard to teach him, and their house reflected that discipline. Solid, well-kept, nothing extravagant. I settled into a routine quickly. I cooked dinner 3 nights a week, kept the yard, drove their 2 boys to soccer practice on Tuesdays when Nicole had her book club. I thought I was useful. I thought I was wanted. What I didn't understand, what I wouldn't understand until much later, was that Nicole had a different accounting of things than I did. Her sister Pamela had been living in Charlotte for 6 years, working in pharmaceutical sales, recently divorced. Nicole and Pamela had the particular closeness of sisters who'd been through something difficult together when they were young, a closeness that excluded other people, even when those people were standing in the same room. I'd noticed it over the years at family dinners, the way they developed their own shorthand mid-conversation, the way Nicole's face went different when Pamela called. Not bad different, just private, sealed off. Pamela's company transferred her to Raleigh in early June. I know now that Nicole had been planning the conversation with me for at least 3 weeks before she had it. I know because Daniel told me later, after everything, sitting in my kitchen with his coffee going cold in his hands, that she'd mapped the whole thing out like a project timeline. I didn't find this surprising. Nicole was a project manager by profession and temperament both. It was a Tuesday evening. Daniel had gotten home late, still in his work shirt, the tie loosened but not removed. Nicole had made pasta, which I'd offered to help with, and she'd declined pleasantly. We were cleaning up, the 3 of us, the boys already upstairs doing homework, and the kitchen had the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned to share a space. Then Nicole set down her dish towel, turned to face me with both hands on the counter, and said, "We need to talk about the living situation." I'd heard that phrase before. Everyone has. But there's a particular configuration to someone's posture when they say it that tells you whether they're opening a negotiation or closing one. Nicole's posture was the second kind. Pamela needed the guest room, she explained. Pamela was coming to Raleigh, and she'd need somewhere to stay while she got settled. Maybe 3 or 4 months, maybe a little longer. And the guest room was the logical choice, the only real choice, because she had the 2 boys already in the other rooms, and the house just wasn't built for 4 adults. I looked at Daniel. He was at the sink, running water that didn't need running, looking at the faucet with professional concentration. "Son?" I said. He turned the water off. He turned around. He had the look of a man who'd been shown the speech beforehand and had agreed, in private, to stand behind it. "Dad, it's just the timing," he said. "We didn't plan for this. It's not about you. It's just, it's fine," Nicole said, which is a thing people say when they've decided the other person's objections don't require addressing. "We're not asking you to disappear. We just need to figure out a new arrangement. Something that gives everyone a little more space." I asked what arrangement she had in mind. She had a list ready. An apartment complex 15 minutes away had a nice 1-bedroom with all utilities included. She'd looked into assisted living communities, and there were 2 highly rated ones in the county, both very reasonably priced. Daniel's college friend had a rental property near the university that might work for something short-term. I listened to all of it. I kept my face neutral and my hands relaxed and my breathing steady. 40 years as a structural engineer had taught me that the most important thing you can do when something is collapsing is resist the urge to run and instead observe clearly where the failure actually is. The failure here was not in the guest room. The failure was at the kitchen sink. "I'll make some calls," I said. "Give me a few days." Nicole's smile returned. "Of course. Take your time. There's no rush." There was, in fact, a rush. I understood this the way you understand weather changes before they arrive, a shift in pressure, the particular quality of light. Pamela was coming in 3 weeks. The guest room needed to be available. The polite language about taking my time was courtesy packaging around a deadline they'd already set without telling me. I said goodnight and went to the guest room and closed the door quietly. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. I didn't turn on the lamp. The room held the small arrangements I'd made over 14 months. The photograph of Margaret on the nightstand, the stack of engineering journals I still subscribed to out of old habit, the reading glasses on top, the worn leather chair I'd brought from Savannah that didn't quite fit the room's color scheme but that I'd sat in for 22 years. I thought about Daniel at the sink, running water that wasn't dirty. I thought about the first time I'd helped them, not with money that came later. The first time was labor. Daniel and Nicole had bought their house 6 years ago, and the inspection had flagged several structural concerns, none critical, but all expensive. I'd driven up from Savannah and spent 3 weekends with them, crawling through the crawl space, reinforcing the subfloor joists, rebuilding the load-bearing wall in the basement that someone had wrong-headedly modified sometime in the 1990s. I'd saved them at minimum $40,000 in contractor fees. Daniel had grilled steaks both Sundays and called me a lifesaver and meant it. Then there was the business loan. Daniel had left corporate accounting 4 years ago to start his own tax and financial planning practice. He was talented, honestly talented, but the startup costs had outpaced his projections, and the second year had been brutal. He'd called me in March, his voice careful and measured the way it gets when he needs something he's embarrassed to ask for. The practice was going to fail if he couldn't cover operating expenses through July. "Just a bridge, Dad. 6 months. I'll pay every penny back." I transferred $85,000 to his business account the following Monday. He paid back $12,000 over the next 2 years, and then the payments had stopped without discussion, and I hadn't pressed. He was building something. I wanted him to succeed. There was also the $900 a month I'd been sending since I moved in, deposited directly into their joint account on the first of every month. Daniel had framed it as me contributing to household expenses. I'd agreed because it felt right, because I was eating their food and using their electricity and it seemed fair. I hadn't thought much about whether they'd started depending on it as income. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app and spent about 20 minutes reviewing the past 4 years of transactions. Dates, amounts, purposes. I wrote nothing down. I didn't need to. I'd been a structural engineer for 4 decades. I understood load-bearing. The total came to $173,000. I set the phone face down on the nightstand next to Margaret's photograph, lay back on the bed with my hands folded on my chest, and looked at the ceiling. What settled in me was not anger. Anger is reactive, and reactive things are inefficient. What settled in me was the same cold clarity I feel when I'm looking at a drawing and I find the error a quiet, precise understanding of where the problem actually is and what will be required to correct it. I fell asleep around midnight and slept better than I had in months. The next morning I made coffee early and drove myself around Raleigh for 2 hours with no particular destination. I needed to think in motion, the way I always have. Margaret used to say I did my best work in the car, and she wasn't wrong. I drove through North Hills, through Hayes Barton, out along Falls of News Road, where the neighborhoods thin out and the lots get larger. On the way back, I cut through Oberlin Road on impulse, and then swung into the 5 Points neighborhood, where Daniel and Nicole's house sat on the corner of a quiet block. I drove past their house slowly, not stopping. Their street, their corner lot, their front porch. I knew every crack in that sidewalk. I'd re-poured a section of it myself last spring. And then, 3 houses down, on the opposite side of the street, I saw it. A blue and white for sale sign, Sutherland Realty, planted in the front lawn of a craftsman bungalow with a deep front porch, a mature magnolia in the yard, and a covered carport. The sign had the look of something recently posted. The paint on the sign was bright. I slowed to a stop. The bungalow was narrower than Daniel's house, but longer. 2 stories. Older construction, probably 1940s. The front porch faced the street at an angle that would give an unobstructed sightline directly to Daniel and Nicole's kitchen window. I photographed the sign. I drove to a coffee shop on Glenwood Avenue and sat with a fresh cup and made 3 phone calls. The first was to Sutherland Realty. The second was to my financial advisor in Savannah. The third was to an attorney named Carl Whitmore, who'd handled the estate after Margaret passed and who I trusted completely. The bungalow was listed at $595,000. It had been on the market for 11 days. The sellers, a couple relocating to the Pacific Northwest, had already dropped the price once. They wanted to close before August. I met with the listing agent, a methodical man named Graham who wore khakis and carried a leather portfolio, the following afternoon. He showed me through the house carefully, professional and unhurried. The bones were excellent. Solid balloon frame construction that had been well maintained. The kitchen had been updated in the last year. The bathrooms were clean and functional, the hardwood floors original and beautiful under several coats of old finish that would sand off cleanly. The room that interested me most was upstairs, front-facing, at the top of the staircase. A home office, Graham said, used by the previous owner as a study. The window was wide, low, and looked directly across the street. I stood at that window with my hands in my pockets and looked at Daniel and Nicole's house. Their kitchen light was on. I could see the countertop clearly. The boys' bicycles were on the front porch. Nicole's car was in the driveway. "The sellers?" I said, without turning from the window. "How motivated are they?" "Quite motivated," Graham said. "They've made an offer on a property in Oregon that's contingent on this closing. Cash, 21-day close. $560,000, I said. "I'll waive the inspection contingency if they provide a recent disclosure statement." There was a pause. Graham was running the numbers, weighing the below-ask offer against the speed and certainty of cash. "I'll present it this afternoon," he said. They countered at $575,000. I agreed. I didn't mention any of this to Daniel or Nicole. I told them I was looking at apartments, that I'd found a few promising options, that I expected to have something settled within the month. Nicole thanked me warmly. Daniel looked relieved and guilty in approximately equal measure, which was about right. The inspection period, which I'd technically waived for contingency purposes, but retained the right to conduct for informational purposes, confirmed what I'd assessed visually. The house was structurally sound. Some cosmetic updating needed. Nothing urgent. I hired a contractor on day 4 of escrow. A woman named Patricia who came, recommended by a former colleague, and who understood, when I walked her through the upstairs study with my sketched floor plan, exactly what I was trying to achieve. Tear the wall-to-wall shelving from in front of the main window. Refinish the floors. Paint the walls a warm slate gray. Install a built-in desk running the full width of the front wall, positioned so that anyone sitting at it would look directly out through the window and across the street. "You want this to feel like a real office," Patricia said. "It is a real office," I said. She quoted me $14,000 for everything. The work took 9 days. I moved in on a Friday in late July, 26 days after my daughter-in-law had told me to find somewhere else to live. I brought the leather chair from Savannah, the photograph of Margaret, the journals, the books. The furniture delivery came that afternoon. By evening, the house was livable. By the following morning, it was home. I sat at the desk and opened my laptop and spent an hour answering emails. The window in front of me framed the street below and the house across it with the precision of a photograph. Daniel's house looked exactly as it always had. Porch light on, newspaper at the end of the walk, Nicole's car in the driveway, the boys' bicycles still on the porch where someone kept meaning to put them away. At 7:48, Nicole came out the front door in her work clothes, bag over her shoulder. She walked to her car, put the bag in the back seat, went around to the driver's side, and paused with her hand on the door handle. She had seen my car in the driveway. She stood very still. I watched her look at the car, look at the house, look at the upstairs window where I was sitting. I could not read her expression at that distance with precision, but I could read her posture, and her posture said that she was rapidly revising something she thought she understood. I raised my hand and waved slowly from the window, a friendly, unhurried gesture, the wave of a neighbor saying good morning. Nicole got in her car and left without acknowledging it. 20 minutes later, Daniel appeared on their front porch in his work shirt, looking across the street. He stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets. Then he took out his phone. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me. I looked at it. A text from Daniel. "Dad, is that your car across the street?" I typed back, "Good morning. Yes, it is. Let me know when you're free to catch up." The dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, okay. I went back to my emails. The first week passed quietly. I established my routine. Morning coffee at the desk, work from 8 until noon, lunch in the kitchen, an afternoon walk through the neighborhood or out to the park on Oberlin. I nodded to neighbors on the sidewalk. An older man named Roy, who lived 2 houses down, stopped to introduce himself one morning, and we talked for 20 minutes about the neighborhood, the light rail extension, the new coffee shop on the corner. I mentioned I had family nearby. He said that was nice. I was visible, present, completely ordinary. Across the street, I watched their patterns with the practiced attention of someone who'd spent his career understanding how structures under load behave before they fail. Nicole leaving each morning at precisely 7:48. Daniel at 8:10. The boys picked up for school at 7:30. In the evenings, lights going on room by room, the choreography of a household's nightly rhythm. Pamela's car appearing in the driveway for the first time on a Saturday, 2 weeks after I'd moved in. A rental car, North Carolina plates, luggage being carried up the front walk. I watched this from my desk, coffee in hand, without expression. Pamela's presence added a new variable I'd anticipated but not fully calculated. A third adult increased the household's food costs and utilities. More significantly, it changed the social dynamics in ways that would not become apparent immediately. Nicole and Pamela's relationship, warm and sealed off as it had always been, would impose its own rhythms on the household. Daniel would find himself a step outside of things, the way he'd always been a step outside of the Nicole and Pamela world, even at Christmas dinners. But that was their concern, not mine. On a Monday morning, 3 weeks after I moved in, I called Carl Whitmore. Carl practiced out of a downtown office in a building he'd occupied since 1987. He was 71 years old and had the particular confidence of someone who has never once been rushed. I'd trusted him with the estate settlement after Margaret died. He did not waste words. I told him what I needed. I walked him through the transactions, dates, amounts, documentation, the $85,000 business transfer, which I had sent by wire with a memo line reading, "Loan to be repaid," and which I had followed with a confirmatory email to Daniel that read in part, "I'm glad I can help with this. We can talk about repayment terms whenever things stabilize." Daniel had responded, "Thank you, Dad. I'll make this right, I promise." Carl was quiet for a moment. "You documented it as a loan at the time." "I did." And the email confirms his acknowledgement. "Yes, the monthly deposits are harder," he said. "No explicit loan language there." "I'm not claiming the monthly deposits," I said. "I'm only claiming the $85,000. Another brief pause. "Irving, I want to make sure I understand what you're after here. Are you trying to collect, or are you trying to communicate?" It was exactly the right question, which is why I trusted him. "Both," I said, "but mostly the second." "All right," Carl said. "Give me 2 weeks." The letter arrived at Daniel's address on a Thursday. I know because I watched him retrieve it from the mailbox that evening, along with the usual stack of envelopes and catalogs. He sorted through the mail at the foot of the driveway the way people do, bills and junk separated reflexively. And then he stopped. He stood at the end of his driveway for a full minute reading the letter. Then he looked up at my house. He went inside. The lights in their house moved in ways that told a story. Kitchen, then living room, then kitchen again, then upstairs, then back down. Through my window, I could see the shapes of 2 people in their kitchen in conversation that grew over the course of 30 minutes, increasingly animated. A third shape, Pamela, appeared briefly, looked at the letter, and left the room. My phone rang at Ota, Suvo Fira PM Daniel. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9:15, again at 9:40. At 10:02, a text arrived. "Dad, we need to talk about this letter. Please call me." I replied, "Good night, Daniel. Talk tomorrow." He came over the next morning, alone, while Nicole was at work. I'd made coffee. I answered the door before he knocked. We sat in my living room. He had the letter in his hand, slightly creased from being read multiple times. He set it on the coffee table between us. "Dad." He looked at me with an expression that contained several things at once: anger and guilt and confusion, and something underneath all of it that might have been admiration, though he wasn't ready to acknowledge that yet. "You're suing me." Carl filed the claim. "Yes, you gave me that money." I poured coffee, set his cup in front of him. I transferred it with a memo line reading, "Loan to be repaid." "You responded via email thanking me and confirming you'd make it right." "Carl has both." Daniel sat back. He pressed his fingers to his forehead. "We were struggling, Dad. I told you that." "I know. I wanted to help." I did help. I kept my voice level, without heat. The loan documentation was routine. I do it for everything. Old habit, from 40 years of professional practice. We paid back $12,000. "You did. And then things got tight and He stopped. "You stopped paying," I said simply. "And I didn't press. I should have. That's my error. But the debt exists, Daniel. $73,000. He was quiet. Outside, a car moved slowly past on the street. The morning was overcast, the light flat and gray. "Why now?" he finally asked. I looked at my son. I looked at him the way I'd looked at buildings for 40 years, not with emotion, but with clear assessment, finding what was load-bearing and what was decorative. "Because 14 months ago, I moved into your guest room to help your family and myself both, after your mother died. I cooked your meals, I kept your yard, I drove your boys to practice. I did it because I loved you and because I thought that's what family was." He didn't look away. "And then your wife decided she needed the room for her sister, and you sat at the kitchen sink and said, 'Maybe we can work something out.'" I paused. "Those were your exact words, Daniel. 'Maybe we can work something out.' As if your father's living situation was a scheduling conflict." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. "I should have said more," he said. "I know that. You should have said something. Anything." I set down my cup. "I'm not asking for an apology today. I'm asking you to speak with Carl about a repayment arrangement. He has my complete authority to negotiate terms." Daniel nodded slowly, looking at the table. "The monthly transfers," he said. "They've stopped too." Yes, he absorbed this. "Nicole said she noticed last month." I didn't answer that. He looked up. "We've been budgeting around that money, Dad. It's been part of how we—" "I know," I said. "That was my error too. Money given without structure becomes expectation. I didn't want you to feel beholden, so I never made it formal. And you both stopped seeing it as generosity and started seeing it as income." I stood, moved toward the door. "That's corrected now." Daniel stood too. He picked up the letter from the table, folded it again, put it in his pocket. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame, the same way I used to pause when I was leaving somewhere I wasn't ready to leave. "Dad," he said, "are you okay over here?" "I'm better than okay," I said honestly. He nodded once and walked across the street. I watched him from the doorway. His walk was the walk of a man who has received information that changes the way he'll need to move through the next several months. The weeks that followed had their own architecture. The 1st of August came and went with no transfer to Daniel's account. I watched through my window as their household absorbed this without visible drama. Though I knew from the patterns, longer lights on in the evenings, Nicole's weekend errand routes becoming more deliberate. A Sunday morning I saw her at the kitchen table with papers spread around her, adding numbers that didn't add up the way she wanted, that the gap was real. Pamela was another variable. The 3 or 4 months Nicole had described stretched past the first marker without discussion. Pamela's rental car was replaced with a purchased one. Her boxes appeared in the hallway, then in the guest room, then gradually throughout the house in the way belongings expand to fill available space. By September, she was a permanent fixture, A second woman with her own preferences about temperature and food and television schedules. Her own friends calling at hours that weren't always convenient. I heard later from Daniel that September had been difficult in ways that had nothing to do with me. Pamela and Nicole's closeness, examined at close range and constant proximity, had revealed its frictions. What worked over holiday weekends did not work across 7 days a week. Daniel, who'd lived in his own house, on his own terms for 6 years, found himself navigating a household that no longer organized itself around him. He came to see me again in late September. A Thursday evening, uninvited, the way he used to stop by when he was in college and needed something more than he needed to admit he needed it. I opened the door. He stood on the porch, looking slightly defeated. "Come in," I said. "I'll make coffee." We sat in the kitchen this time, not the living room, less formal. He wrapped both hands around his cup and was quiet for a moment. "Carl and I have been talking," he said. "I know. He keeps me informed. He said you'd be willing to discuss a structured repayment over 5 years." "That's accurate." "That's more than fair, Dad." He looked at me directly. "More than fair." I didn't say anything. "I've been thinking about what you said. About the sink." He looked at his coffee. "I've thought about it a lot, actually. About why I just stood there. Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've spent 15 years choosing the easier path with Nicole. Not because she's a bad person. She's not. But because conflict with her costs more than I've been willing to pay. And somewhere along the way, I started substituting that math for a different one, without even noticing." He looked up. "You were the difference. The cost of standing up for you felt too high. So I stood at the sink and turned the water on." I studied him. My son, 40 years old, looking at something in himself he'd been looking away from for a long time. "That's honest," I said. "It's late." "It is," I agreed. "But it's not nothing." He turned his cup in his hands. "Nicole and I have been talking too. About a lot of things. About Pamela. About money. About what we actually want." He paused. "She wants to come talk to you. She asked me to ask you if that would be okay. I considered this. When she's ready to do it directly and honestly, I'm here." He nodded. "I'll tell her." 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, I saw them cross the street together, Daniel and Nicole, side by side, not holding hands, each carrying something. Daniel had coffee in a travel mug. Nicole had her hands at her sides, fingers not quite relaxed, a person preparing for something she'd decided to do and not entirely made peace with yet. I opened the door before they reached it. Nicole stood on my porch. She was in weekend clothes, hair pulled back, without the professional composure she usually wore like a second skin. She looked younger without it, and also more honest. "I owe you an apology," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort behind it. "What I did was wrong. The way I handled it, the whole thing was wrong. You'd been part of our household for over a year, and I treated you like a problem to be managed, not a person to be respected." She paused. "I'm sorry. It wasn't effortless. It wasn't warm. But it was real. And in my experience, real is considerably more valuable than warm." "I accept your apology," I said. "Come in." We sat in the living room. I called Carl from my cell on speaker and instructed him to file the dismissal that afternoon. He confirmed it would be done before end of day Monday. Nicole exhaled slowly. "I want to be clear about something," I said, setting the phone down. "The lawsuit is over. The monthly transfers are not coming back. What I gave you over the years was genuine, but it was also corrosive in ways I didn't see clearly enough. You both started building your lives around my money instead of your own decisions, and that's partly on me for not setting clearer terms." I looked at them both. "You're capable people. You can do this. You should do this." Daniel nodded. Nicole looked at the table, then looked up. "Pamela's moving out next month," she said. "It cost her something to say it. That's your business, not mine." "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to know." They stayed another half hour. We talked about the boys, about Daniel's practice, about a project I was considering taking on through an old colleague. When they left, they walked back across the street together, closer than they'd been when they arrived. I watched them from the front porch, coffee in hand. The Raleigh morning settled around me in its particular October light. October became November. I finished the consulting project for my old colleague, a structural assessment of a mixed-use development downtown. The work was clean, and I did it well. My client asked if I'd consider additional projects. I told him I'd think about it, and I meant it as a real consideration rather than polite deferral. I had dinner with Daniel and Nicole and the boys in late November, the Sunday before Thanksgiving. It was the first time I'd been in their house since I'd moved out. The guest room, Pamela's former room, had been cleared and repainted. The boys showed me their school projects. Nicole cooked, and I didn't offer to help, and she didn't ask. And this felt like a kind of respect in both directions. After dinner, the boys went upstairs, and the three of us sat at the table with wine, and the conversation went to ordinary things. The neighborhood, a film Daniel had seen, a road trip they were considering for spring break. At some point, Nicole asked about the bungalow, whether I was planning to stay long-term or eventually look for something different. I like it there, I said honestly. The office especially. Good light. She looked at the table for a moment with an expression I'd learned over these months to recognize as Nicole thinking something she was deciding whether to say. Then she looked up. We can see your light on sometimes in the evenings. I know, I said. A pause. Then, carefully. I think it was good for us. Knowing you were there, I looked at her. She meant it as something more than she was saying, and she knew I understood that, and neither of us needed to make it explicit. I think so too, I said. Later that evening, I walked home across the street, the November air cold and clarifying, the lights on in the bungalow exactly as I'd left them. I went upstairs, sat at the desk, opened my laptop, Margaret's photograph on the corner of the desk, the city quiet outside. I'd spent 40 years as an engineer, understanding one fundamental thing. A structure doesn't fail because of a single bad moment. It fails because of accumulated stress on an element that was never built for the load it was asked to carry. The repair requires identifying the actual failure, not just the visible crack. And after the repair, the structure can hold more than it did before, if the work was done correctly. I opened the consulting file and continued where I'd left off. Outside, across the street, the lights in Daniel's house went off room by room as the evening settled. First the kitchen, then the living room, finally the bedroom upstairs. Ordinary rhythms. A family doing what families do, carrying what they can carry. I kept working. The desk lamp lit the page. The coffee was still warm. I had good years ahead of me yet, and I intended to use every one of them exactly as I chose.